Have you ever wondered why some people seem to carry an entire universe inside them, yet struggle to let anyone in? Why the most emotionally aware among us often feel the most alone? There's a pattern here, something Carl Jung spent his life understanding. And if you felt emotionally alone as a child, what he discovered about the human mind might finally explain why you think the way you do as an adult. Jung once wrote something that stops people in their tracks. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Read that again. Not about being physically alone, about carrying something inside that has no place to land. That was your childhood, wasn't it? You weren't always isolated in the obvious sense. There were people around, noise, activity, birthday parties and family dinners and classrooms full of other kids. But there was a different kind of absence, one that's harder to name. You felt it when you looked outward and nothing came back, when your inner world reached for connection and found only empty space. You learned something very early, something most children never have to learn. You learned how to keep yourself company, not as a skill you chose to develop, but as a necessity for survival. Certain feelings didn't have anywhere to go. Questions sat unanswered for long stretches. Being understood wasn't something you could rely on. So you stopped waiting for it. You don't remember deciding this. You remember adjusting. The child who becomes a Carl Jung empath doesn't become that way by choice. They become it because their sensitivity met a world that couldn't hold it. Jung understood this deeply. He knew that some people are born with what he called permeable boundaries, with nervous systems that feel everything more intensely. When those children grow up without emotional attunement, something specific happens in their psychological development. You became observant, careful, internally busy. While other kids moved outward toward the world, you moved inward away from it. You learned how to think through things on your own, how to calm yourself down without reassurance, how to sit with confusion without asking for help. People often describe you as independent. They don't realize that independence wasn't a choice. It started as adaptation to emotional neglect psychology, to a world that couldn't see you clearly. There's a particular sensation that comes from this. It's not dramatic, it's subtle. A constant feeling that you're slightly out of sync with everyone around you. Present but not fully accompanied. You learn to read between words, to sense moods before they were named, to understand situations without explanation. That kind of emotional awareness became second nature. Even now, you notice things before others do. Shifts in tone, energy changes, the exact moment someone begins to pull back long before they admit it. You don't react outwardly. You've never been good at that. You store it instead. You've always been skilled at storing things. Feelings that had no witnesses, thoughts that didn't feel welcome, questions that seemed inconvenient. Jung would tell you this created a specific psychological structure, one that most people never develop. You learned to keep things inside until they made sense. Sometimes they never did. But the waiting, the processing, the constant internal sorting that became the architecture of your mind. You grew up faster in certain ways. Not because you had to take care of others, though maybe you did that too, but because you had to take care of yourself emotionally. You didn't expect comfort to arrive, so you became comfortable without it. That comfort came with a cost you're still paying. You became what Jung called self-contained. You don't easily assume others will understand you. You don't naturally expect to be supported. When something feels heavy, you don't instinctively reach outward. Reaching feels uncertain, so you think instead. You analyze, you reflect, you replay conversations in your head long after they end. Not because you enjoy it, because your empath inner world learned to do the work that wasn't being done elsewhere. You're often told you're thoughtful, deep, insightful. What they don't see is how that depth formed. They don't see how often you had to process emotion completely alone. How early you learned to become your own witness. This is where something interesting begins to happen. You became exceptionally skilled at understanding other people. You had to. Understanding was how you stayed connected without being fully seen. You learned how to listen without interrupting, how to empathize without being asked, how to be present without demanding presence in return. People feel safe with you. They open up, they confide, they relax. You hold space naturally the way some people breathe. But when it's your turn, something shifts. You don't know how to step into the center of attention without discomfort. You don't know how to be emotionally messy in front of someone else. You don't trust that your inner world will be handled gently. So you keep it tidy. You share selectively. You edit yourself. You stay composed. Not because you're closed, but because you learned that exposure doesn't always lead to connection. Sometimes it leads to disappointment. Sometimes to being misunderstood. Sometimes to nothing at all. You've noticed something else too. You often feel closer to people in your head than you do in real time. You understand them deeply, can predict their reactions, know what they need. But they only see parts of you. That imbalance feels familiar. It feels like childhood, being present without being fully met. You don't resent it. You've normalized it. You tell yourself you're just private, just introspective, just someone who doesn't need much. But sometimes, late at night when your mind is finally quiet, a different feeling surfaces. Not a need for attention, something subtler, a need for resonance, for the sense that your inner experience exists in someone else's awareness. You've learned to live without that. But living without something doesn't mean you don't feel its absence. It just means you've adapted to it. And here's what Jung would want you to understand. Those adaptations didn't disappear when you grew up. They became the foundation of how you think, how you approach relationships, how you make decisions, how you process pain. You don't expect others to fill emotional gaps. You fill them yourself. That self-sufficiency looks like strength, and it is. But it's also a clue. Because people who never felt emotionally alone don't think this way. They don't monitor connection like a radar system. They don't brace for misunderstanding. They don't assume silence means disinterest. You do. Automatically. Not because you're pessimistic, because you learned what happens when you hope too openly. So you hope quietly. You stay observant. You stay measured. You stay slightly detached. And that detachment isn't what others think it is. It's not indifference. It's not coldness. It's familiarity. It's the echo of having learned very early how to be with yourself when no one else showed up. What kind of thinking develops in a child who learns emotional self-reliance before they learn what it feels like to be emotionally held? Jung spent his entire career mapping the human psyche, and he discovered something crucial about people like you. He identified what he called psychological types, fundamental differences in how people process the world. At the core of his theory was a distinction that explains almost everything about your childhood experience. He wrote about introversion not as shyness, but as the direction of psychic energy. Some people, he explained, recharge by turning inward. Their energy flows toward their inner world, toward reflection and internal processing. Others recharge through external stimulation, through action and interaction. You were the first type. You've always been. But being an introverted child in a world that values extroversion is challenging enough. Being an introverted child with a heightened sensitivity of an empath, that's something else entirely. That's double isolation. While other kids recharge through noise and play and constant social contact, you needed quiet to reorganize yourself. You needed space to process what you were feeling. You needed time alone, not because you disliked people, but because being around them was so intense that it drained something essential from you. The world misunderstood this completely. Your need for inner space looked like aloofness. Your need to retreat looked like rejection. Your need to think before responding looked like hesitation or uncertainty. And when you're a child, you don't have the language to explain that you're not avoiding connection. You're just trying to survive it. There's a line from Jung that validates this so perfectly. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. You weren't broken for needing what you needed. You just needed something different than what most people understood. So the adaptation began. When the outer world didn't meet, you couldn't understand your rhythms. The inner world expanded to fill the gap. And this is where empath psychology becomes fascinating. Because what grew inside you wasn't just coping mechanism. It was an entirely different way of being conscious. Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear for the world, the version of ourselves we present to navigate social reality. Everyone develops a persona, but for the emotionally alone child, it develops early and it develops thick. You learned what was acceptable to show and what needed to stay hidden. You learned to be the good child, the independent one, the mature for your age kid who didn't make waves or demands. You learned to perform okayness, even when you felt anything but okay. Beneath that mask, your real self continued growing. A rich inner world expanding in secret. Full of feelings you couldn't name, questions you couldn't ask, observations you couldn't share. And the distance between your public self and your private self grew wider every year. Jung warned about this. He understood that maintaining a persona requires enormous energy. It's exhausting to constantly monitor what you show and what you hide, to always translate your internal experience into something more palatable for others, to live split between who you are and who you pretend to be. But there was another cost one Jung wrote about extensively. He called it the shadow. Every part of ourselves that we learn to reject or hide doesn't disappear. It goes underground into the unconscious, where it continues to influence us in ways we don't recognize. For you, the shadow became the repository of all your unmet needs. Your desire to be vulnerable without fear. Your longing to be understood without explanation. Your need for consistent emotional presence. These weren't bad things. They weren't weaknesses. They were completely human needs that your environment couldn't accommodate. So they became shadow material, hidden even from yourself. And here's the pattern that followed you into adulthood. You're still uncomfortable expressing those needs. You still edit your vulnerability. You still assume that needing too much makes you a burden. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Your shadow isn't small. It's full of every normal human need you learn to suppress. And until you bring it into consciousness, it will keep shaping your relationships from the dark. But here's where the deep psychology video of your life takes an unexpected turn. Because Jung also wrote about what he called the wounded healer archetype. The person who gains the ability to heal others precisely through their own suffering. And this is what happened to you. Your emotional isolation forced early psychological development. You had to become your own support system, your own emotional translator, your own source of comfort and understanding. And in doing that, you developed capacities most people never need to develop. You became an observer, not just of others, but of your own internal processes. You learned to watch your feelings, to track your thoughts, to understand the subtle movements of your inner world. You became a translator, someone who could read energy and subtext and all the unspoken emotional currents running beneath conversation. You became what Jung would call a feeler, someone whose primary way of knowing the world is through emotional perception. And while that brought pain, it also brought extraordinary sensitivity. You can sense when something is off before anyone else notices. You can feel the emotional temperature of a room the moment you walk in. You recognize depth in others because you carry so much of it yourself. This wasn't just survival. This was the beginning of what Jung called individuation and the process of becoming your whole self. Your wound became your teacher. Your isolation became your training ground. Your early emotional neglect psychology, painful as it was, shaped you into someone capable of seeing what others miss. When Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," he was talking about this journey, about taking everything you've been through and transforming it from random suffering into meaningful development, about recognizing that your sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's a form of perception that allows you to navigate dimensions of human experience that others can't even see. But this gift came with a cost. It came with a very specific way of thinking that still shapes how you move through the world. If this is resonating, drop a comment sharing one pattern you recognize in yourself. And subscribe, because we're going deeper into how your past shaped the way your mind works today. What Jung discovered about consciousness can help you understand something you might have always wondered about yourself. Why do you think so differently from other people? Why does your mind work the way it does? Jung wrote extensively about the self, the center of psychological totality. Most people develop their sense of self through mirroring. A child expresses emotion, and a caregiver reflects it back with understanding. Over time, through thousands of these small interactions, the child learns who they are. They develop a stable sense of self by being seen. But you developed the self differently. You had to. Without consistent emotional mirroring from the outside, you learned to mirror yourself. You became both subject and object, observer and observed, the one experiencing and the one watching the experience. This created what Jungian psychology calls the internal witness. And it's probably one of the most distinctive features of how you think as an adult. You don't just have experiences. You watch yourself having them. You don't just feel emotions. You observe yourself feeling them. There's this doubled consciousness that never quite turns off. You're living your life and simultaneously observing yourself living it. Processing experience in real time and then processing the processing. It's exhausting sometimes, isn't it? This constant meta-awareness. Other people can be fully absorbed in the moment. You're always slightly removed, watching it unfold from some internal distance. Jung would tell you this isn't dissociation, though it might feel like it sometimes. It's a highly developed form of self-reflection that emerged because you needed to become your own emotional support system. Think about childhood trauma, not as a single dramatic event, but as the quiet accumulation of unmet emotional needs. You learned early that you couldn't rely on others to help you make sense of your feelings. So your psyche developed this internal observer who could do that work, who could say, "You're feeling sad right now. That makes sense because of what just happened. You're not broken. This will pass." You parented yourself emotionally. And that internal parent is still there, still watching, still trying to make sense of everything you feel. Jung developed a technique he called active imagination, a way of engaging with the unconscious through internal dialogue and imagery. For him, it was a deliberate practice. For you, it was necessity before you even knew what to call it. As a child, you created internal companions. Not imaginary friends exactly, though maybe those too. But whole conversations inside your head. Complex inner worlds that felt more real, more reliable than the outer one. Your imagination became the place where you could be fully alive without risking rejection or misunderstanding. And you still do this. Your inner world is extraordinarily rich. You have internal dialogues that are more complex than most people's external ones. You can spend hours inside your own head thinking through scenarios, processing emotions, making sense of experience. Sometimes that inner world feels more vivid than reality. This is both gift and burden. The gift is obvious. You have access to depths of imagination and introspection that fuel creativity and insight. The burden is subtler. External reality can feel thin by comparison. Real relationships can seem less interesting than the versions you imagine. Actual conversation can disappoint after the richness of internal dialogue. You retreat into your inner world when connection disappoints. It's automatic. The moment you feel misunderstood or unseen, you withdraw into the one place that's always been safe, your own mind. Jung wouldn't call this escapism. He'd recognize it as returning to your primary source of psychological nourishment. But here's the question that matters. Can these two worlds, inner and outer, ever truly reconcile? Jung had a principle he called compensation. The psyche, he believed, always seeks balance. When something is absent in one area, it strengthens in another. When external emotional support was missing from your childhood, your internal psychological mechanisms didn't just maintain. They intensified. You developed extraordinary capacities for self-soothing, for self-analysis, for self-regulation, for self-understanding. While other children were learning how to seek comfort from others, you were learning how to provide it for yourself. This created psychological independence much earlier than is natural or healthy. And here's the adult thinking pattern that emerged. I can handle this alone. It's automatic, reflexive, the default position your mind moves to whenever challenge appears. You don't consider asking for help until you've already exhausted every possible way of handling it yourself. Support feels uncertain, so you default to self-reliance. This looks like strength, and in many ways, it is. But Jung would want you to see the hidden cost to the difficulty receiving help, the discomfort with accepting care, the inability to truly lean on others even when they're offering to hold you. Every psychological strength Jung understood is also a limitation. Your self-sufficiency protects you from disappointment, but also isolates you from genuine interdependence. Your independence keeps you safe, but prevents you from experiencing the profound vulnerability that deep connection requires. Now let's talk about something you probably recognize immediately. The emotionally alone child becomes an expert pattern reader. You had to. Your psychological survival depended on your ability to predict emotional danger. You learned to track mood shifts before they became obvious, to sense withdrawal before it was expressed, to detect relational tension before it erupted. This wasn't paranoia. This was intelligent adaptation. If you could see the change coming, you could brace for it. Prepare. Protect yourself. This pattern recognition became sophisticated to the point of seeming supernatural. You notice micro-expressions most people miss. You hear tone shifts that others dismiss as imagination. You feel energy changes in a room before anyone acknowledges them. But here's what Jung would want you to understand. This hypervigilance that you think of as intuition is actually unconscious pattern matching based on early threat detection. Your nervous system learned to scan for signs of emotional withdrawal, because withdrawal once meant abandonment. And that programming never shut off. As an adult, you notice when someone starts to pull back before they even consciously decide to. You feel the shift in their energy, the slight cooling in their warmth, the micro-hesitation before they respond. And your system reads it as danger, even when it might just be them having a bad day. You're always scanning, always preparing, never fully relaxing into connection because some part of you is constantly monitoring for signs that it might end. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." These patterns are unconscious. They run automatically, and they shape every relationship you attempt. But there's something else, something deeper that Jung discovered about consciousness. He called it the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche that exists beneath personal experience, universal patterns, and archetypal images that all humans share. Most people connect to this layer occasionally in dreams or moments of profound insight, but empaths, particularly those who felt emotionally alone as children, often have unusually strong access to it. And this might explain something you've always felt but never quite understood. When personal connection failed you, when individual relationships couldn't provide the mirroring you needed, you connected to something larger, something universal. You feel things that seem to come from beyond your personal experience. Ancestral grief, collective pain, the weight of human suffering across time. This isn't your imagination. In Jungian psychology, this is understood as real psychic material. You're touching archetypal patterns, universal human experiences that exist in the deeper layers of consciousness. This is why you can understand suffering you've never personally experienced. Why stories of loss move you even when they're not your own. Why you feel connected to humanity in the abstract even while struggling to connect with individuals in the concrete. The paradox of the Carl Jung empath feeling everything yet feeling alone in it. Understanding the depths of human experience while being unable to share your understanding. Carrying universal emotional truths that have no particular person to share them with. This shaped a specific kind of thinking. You understand people deeply. You see patterns in human behavior that others miss. You recognize emotional truth beneath surface presentation. You can hold complexity and ambiguity in a way that most people find uncomfortable. But intimacy, actual closeness with specific individuals, that remains difficult. Because intimacy requires the very thing your childhood trained you not to expect: consistent emotional presence. Someone staying with you through messiness and need and vulnerability. Someone who doesn't withdraw when things get complex. So here's where we are. Your early emotional isolation created a mind that is self-witnessing, imaginatively rich, compensatorily self-sufficient, hypervigilant to relational patterns, and connected to deep collective currents while struggling with individual intimacy. This isn't pathology, it's adaptation. But Jung would tell you that what served you as a child might be limiting you as an adult. That the psychological structures you built for survival might now be preventing the very connection you most deeply want. So the question becomes, how do you bring consciousness to these unconscious patterns? How do you integrate what's been split? How do you heal what's been wounded without losing the gifts that suffering created? Jung's entire body of work points toward one central concept: individuation. The process of becoming your whole self. Not the self your childhood required you to be. Not the persona you developed to navigate a world that couldn't hold your depth. Your actual, complete, integrated self. For you, this journey means something specific. It means integrating the split between your inner world and your outer presentation. Between the self you know and the self you show. Between your profound emotional capacity and your profound emotional isolation. The first phase of individuation is always recognition. Not judgment, not fixing, just seeing clearly what is. Understanding that your thinking patterns aren't flaws in your character. They're adaptive responses to your early environment. They made sense. They kept you safe. They allowed you to survive emotional circumstances that could have broken you. But survival mode isn't the same as thriving mode. And what protected you as a child might be constraining you as an adult. Start with the persona, that carefully constructed outer self that you learned to present to the world. The independent one, the low-maintenance friend, the person who has it together, the one who doesn't need much. Jung would ask you to notice when you're performing this versus when you're actually being yourself. Pay attention to the moments when you edit what you're really feeling, when you package your truth into something more palatable, when you minimize your needs before expressing them, when you perform okayness even though you feel anything but okay. This is the persona at work. Notice it without judgment. Just observe how often you do this, how automatic it's become, and then ask yourself the question Jung would ask: whose acceptance am I performing for? Often you'll find you're still performing for people who are no longer watching, for the childhood environment that couldn't see you, for the world that taught you your real self wasn't welcome. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because accepting yourself means accepting the parts you learned to hide. The needs you were taught were too much. The vulnerability you learned was unsafe. The emotional messiness you were trained to contain. This brings us to shadow work. Those parts of yourself that got rejected and pushed underground. For you, the shadow isn't full of rage or violence or socially unacceptable impulses. It's full of completely normal human needs that your environment couldn't accommodate. The need to be emotionally messy sometimes, to need consistent presence from others, to expect understanding without having to earn it, to ask for support without feeling like a burden, to be fragile without shame. These needs didn't disappear just because you learned to suppress them. They're still there in the shadow, influencing your relationships from the unconscious. This is why intimacy feels so complicated, why you struggle to let people help you, why receiving care feels more uncomfortable than giving it. The work of integration isn't about judging yourself for having these needs. It's about recognizing that they're human, valid, necessary for wholeness. Jung understood that we can't become whole by rejecting parts of ourselves. We become whole by bringing everything into consciousness and accepting it. This is practical work, not just theoretical understanding. Start small. Find the safest relationship you have, and try a small experiment with expressing need. Not a huge, vulnerable revelation, just something slightly more honest than you usually allow yourself. "I'm having a hard day," instead of "I'm fine." "I could use some company," instead of suffering alone. "That hurt my feelings," instead of pretending it didn't matter. Notice what happens. Notice your discomfort. Notice whether the world actually ends or whether the person responds with more compassion than you expected. Jung believed that we cannot change anything unless we first accept it. And accepting that you have needs, that you're not entirely self-sufficient, that you actually want and deserve emotional support, that's the first step toward a different way of being in relationship. Now let's talk about that internal witness we discussed earlier. The voice that's constantly observing, analyzing, processing your experience. For many empaths and narcissists, dynamics play out internally. First, you've probably noticed this. You internalized both roles. The one who needs and the one who criticizes that need. That witness voice can be harsh. Often it sounds like the emotional neglect you experienced now turned inward. "You shouldn't need this. You're being too much. Other people have it worse. Just handle it yourself." This is the critical parent voice that got internalized when the actual parent, the actual environment, wasn't emotionally available. The transformation here is profound, becoming a compassionate witness instead of a critical one, learning to speak to yourself the way you wish someone had spoken to you as a child. Jung practiced extensive self-reflection, keeping journals, engaging in internal dialogue, but always with a stance of curiosity rather than judgment. Practice noticing the tone of your inner voice. When you're struggling, what does it say? Would you speak to a child that way? Would you speak to a friend that way? If not, why Is it acceptable to speak to yourself with such harshness? The practice is this: when you notice the critical voice, pause, take a breath, and consciously shift to compassion. This is hard. It makes sense that you're struggling. You're doing your best. You deserve gentleness right now. It will feel awkward at first, foreign, like you're lying to yourself. But Jung understood that we have to consciously practice new patterns before they become natural. Self-compassion isn't self-indulgence. It's treating yourself as someone worthy of care. Because you are. Your needs matter. Your feelings are valid. Your struggles deserve witness, even if that witness is only yourself. But the deeper work of inner transformation involves changing how you approach connection with others. Your system was trained for emotional independence. Survival required not depending on anyone else's presence. But Jung's vision of wholeness includes genuine relationship. Not losing yourself in others, but not isolating yourself either. The balance he described is this individual wholeness and authentic connection, being completely yourself and genuinely related to others. This requires something your childhood didn't teach you: interdependence. Not dependence where you lose yourself in someone else's needs. Not independence where you never allow yourself to need anyone. But interdependence, where two whole people choose to be vulnerable with each other, where you can ask for support without dissolving into helplessness, where you can receive care without losing your center. This is the work of choosing people wisely. Your childhood taught you that everyone is unsafe. But the truth is more nuanced. Some people can't hold your depth, and some can. Some people will withdraw when you're authentic, and some won't. The work is learning to tell the difference. Don't reward inconsistency with vulnerability. Don't keep trying to connect with people who've already shown you they can't meet you. Notice who actually shows up, who stays curious about your inner world instead of afraid of it, who meets your complexity with their own depth instead of asking you to simplify yourself. These are the people worth the risk of being seen. These are the relationships where you can practice small revelations before large ones, where you can be imperfect without fear of abandonment, where your emotional awareness becomes a gift instead of a burden. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." Not everyone deserves access to your inner world. And recognizing that isn't building walls. It's wisdom. It's honoring yourself enough to be selective about who gets to witness your depth. Practice this framework. Choose people who have earned your trust through consistent action, not just promising words. Share incrementally. Don't hand over your entire inner world on the first date, whether romantic or platonic. Let people prove they can hold small truths before you trust them with large ones. Notice how they respond to your vulnerability. Do they move toward it with curiosity and care, or do they minimize it, change the subject, make it about themselves? Your empath inner world knows. Trust what you sense, not what you wish were true, and allow yourself to be imperfect in their presence. This is the real test of connection. Can you be messy, confused, not okay, and still be accepted? Can you need something and not feel like a burden? Can you struggle and not feel like you're failing? If yes, you've found someone worth staying open with. If no, you haven't failed. They've just shown you who they are. Believe them. Now we return to the archetype Jung wrote about the wounded healer. This is your deeper story. Your wound, your emotional isolation. It wasn't random suffering. It shaped you into someone capable of profound empathy and psychological insight. You understand what others can't because you've lived through what they haven't had to face. Emotional isolation, the ache of being unseen, the loneliness that comes from carrying an inner world no one seems interested in witnessing. That pain gave you the capacity to recognize it in others. This is why people feel safe with you, why they confide in you, why they sense that you'll understand what they're struggling to say. You can hold their pain without flinching because you've held your own. You can witness their complexity without asking them to simplify because you know what it feels like to be asked to be less than you are. The transformation from isolated to of service isn't despite your history. It's because of it. Jung understood that our greatest wounds, when consciously worked with, become our greatest gifts. Your capacity to be alone, that skill you learned too early, becomes your capacity to be with others in their aloneness. Not trying to fix them, not rescuing them from their pain, just being present to it, recognizing it, offering the one thing you never consistently received, the sense that their inner experience matters, that someone sees it, that they're not alone in their complexity. This is the subtle motivation underneath everything. Your pain had purpose. It wasn't meaningless. It shaped you into someone the world needs. Someone who can hold what others can't. Someone who sees depths that most people miss. Someone who creates safety for emotional truth to be spoken. Jung wrote, "A person who has not passed through the inferno of their passions has never overcome them." Your inferno was loneliness, and you emerged from it with something rare and valuable, the ability to truly see other people. Not the masks they wear, not the personas they perform, but the actual humans struggling beneath the surface. That's not nothing. That's profound. That's the gift hidden in the wound, the treasure that can only be found by descending into your own depths and surviving the journey. Jung's vision of the individuated self, the person who has completed the journey toward wholeness, this isn't about perfection. It's not about transcending your history or erasing your wounds. It's about integration, bringing all the scattered parts of yourself into conscious relationship. For you, this looks like something specific, someone who knows their depth completely and shares it consciously, not compulsively. Someone who can be alone without loneliness consuming them. Someone who can be connected without losing themselves in the process. Someone who holds both independence and intimacy without having to choose between them. The shift is subtle but profound. You're no longer emotionally self-sufficient because you have to be. That was survival. Now you're choosing discernment about where you invest your inner world. That's wisdom. You're not keeping people out because you assume they'll leave. You're being selective because you've learned that not everyone can hold what you carry. There's a difference. One comes from fear and protection. The other comes from self-knowledge and respect. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." And you have looked. You've spent years, maybe decades, exploring your inner landscape, trying to understand why you think the way you do, why relationships feel so complicated, why you can feel so much and yet feel so alone. What you found isn't brokenness. What you found is a psyche that adapted brilliantly to impossible circumstances, a mind that developed extraordinary capacities because ordinary ones weren't enough. A heart that learned to beat on its own because it couldn't rely on anyone else's rhythm. This is who you're becoming, someone who trusts their inner world completely, who doesn't apologize for their depth or try to make themselves smaller to fit other people's comfort, who feels their feelings without shame, all of them, the beautiful and the messy and the complicated. Someone who asks for what they need without collapsing into helplessness, who can be vulnerable without losing their center, who sits in solitude as a choice they're making, not in exile they're enduring. Someone who connects authentically when connection is available and real. Who doesn't perform or pretend or package themselves for consumption. Who shows up as exactly who they are and lets people decide if that's something they can handle. You don't have to be understood by everyone. Jung understood something crucial about human nature. We're not meant to be universally comprehensible. We're meant to be deeply known by a few people who can meet us where we actually are. He wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. You know yours. You've spent years in it, learning its contours, understanding its patterns, making peace with its presence. And that knowledge is power. Power to recognize darkness in others without being afraid of it. Power to hold complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. Power to sit with ambiguity and uncertainty and not knowing. Power to be with people in their struggle without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush them through it. This is the person you're becoming. And the journey continues because individuation isn't a destination. It's not something you complete and then you're done. It's an ongoing process of becoming more and more yourself. More conscious, more integrated, more whole. The invitation is this: keep making the unconscious conscious. Keep noticing the patterns that run automatically. Keep bringing compassion to the parts of yourself that learned they weren't welcome. Keep practicing small acts of vulnerability with people who've earned it. Keep choosing wholeness over acceptance. Because you will have to choose. There will be people and situations that ask you to be less complex, less deep, less emotionally aware. They'll want you to simplify yourself, to be easier, to need less. And you can choose to honor who you actually are instead. To trust that the right people, the ones who matter, won't ask you to shrink. They'll be curious about your depths instead of afraid of them. They'll meet your complexity with their own instead of asking you to reduce it. Jung's wisdom was this: the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You spent childhood becoming what was safe, what was acceptable, what allowed you to survive an environment that couldn't hold your full emotional reality. Now you get to become what is true, what is authentic, what is actually you beneath all the adaptive patterns and protective mechanisms and learned behaviors. This is quiet revolution, not dramatic transformation. It's living from your authentic center instead of from survival mode. Not performing for anyone's approval, not hiding to avoid disapproval, not fragmenting yourself to fit different contexts. Just being, fully, messily, completely yourself. And here's the deepest truth, the one Jung understood about human connection: you were never looking for many people. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were looking for the right resonance, for someone whose emotional language matches yours, who doesn't fear your intensity, who doesn't need you to simplify your inner world. Jung believed we find ourselves through others who mirror our depths, not surface-level mirroring, but deep recognition. The sense that someone sees you, really sees you, and isn't overwhelmed or afraid or asking you to be different. Your people exist. The ones who match your emotional awareness, who appreciate your capacity for depth instead of being threatened by it, who don't withdraw when things get complex because they're comfortable with complexity themselves. And here's what's different now: you're ready for them. Not because you've become less needy or more self-sufficient or finally healed enough to deserve connection, but because you know yourself completely. You understand your patterns, you recognize your wounds, you're conscious of your shadow. That self-knowledge changes everything, because Jung understood that real connection only happens between two people who know themselves. When you meet someone else who's done their own inner work, who's faced their own darkness, who's integrated their own shadow, that's when transformation becomes possible. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But that reaction can only happen when both substances are pure. When you know what you're bringing to the interaction, when you're not projecting unconscious material onto the other person. You're ready now for that kind of meeting, for connection that doesn't require you to abandon yourself, for intimacy that deepens you instead of diminishing you. For relationships where being seen doesn't feel dangerous because the person doing the seeing has the capacity to hold what they find. The transformation is complete when you realize that your early emotional isolation, painful as it was, gave you something invaluable. It gave you depth. It gave you wisdom about the human psyche. It gave you the capacity to be with yourself fully, which is the foundation of being with anyone else authentically. You're not damaged goods waiting to be fixed. You're not broken pieces waiting to be put back together. You're whole already, just in a way that most people don't understand. Your wholeness includes your wounds. Your strength includes your vulnerability. Your independence includes your capacity for deep connection. This is what Jung meant by individuation. Not becoming perfect, becoming complete. Accepting all of yourself, the parts you're proud of, and the parts you've tried to hide, the strengths and the struggles, the gifts and the wounds. And living from that wholeness, making choices that honor your full reality instead of just the parts that are socially acceptable. Building relationships with people who can handle your full emotional range. Creating a life that has room for your inner world instead of asking you to compress it. The emotionally alone child thought they were fundamentally unlovable, that their inner experience was too much, too complex, too intense for anyone to want to be around. The individuated adult knows differently, knows that their depth is precisely what makes genuine connection possible, that their capacity to be alone is what allows them to be truly with others. From emotionally alone to emotionally sovereign, from abandoned to self-possessed, from wounded to healing. This is your journey. And it's not finished. It's never finished. But you're further along than you realize. Jung's promise was that consciousness changes everything. That making the unconscious conscious transforms what felt like fate into choice. That understanding why you think the way you do gives you the power to think differently when you need to. You understand now. You see the patterns. You recognize the adaptations. You know where they came from and what they cost you. That knowledge is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from your past, but freedom to choose how it shapes your future. The child who learned to be emotionally alone before learning what emotional presence felt like, that child is still inside you. And they deserve your compassion. They survived something they shouldn't have had to survive. They developed capacities they shouldn't have needed to develop. They did the best they could with what they had. And they grew into you. Someone deep enough to understand this, strong enough to face it, whole enough to integrate it. Someone who can be alone without being lonely, who can be with others without losing themselves, who knows their inner world completely and shares it consciously. That's not just survival, that's transformation. That's what Jung spent his entire life pointing toward. The journey from unconscious adaptation to conscious choice, from wound to wisdom, from isolation to integration. You're not finished, but you're becoming. And that becoming, that ongoing journey toward wholeness, that's what it means to be fully alive. If this resonated with your experience, share in the comments. What's one thinking pattern from childhood you still recognize in yourself today? And if you want to explore more about how Jungian psychology explains the way empaths process the world, subscribe. There's so much more depth to discover together.